So I'm really excited to have Erika Field here for an interview. Erika designed our wonderful Shorn patterns for this year's launch, and I'm even more excited to be able to talk to you about the actual patterns. So we get to hear about the inspiration and hear about what you do as a designer. And I'm not going to do too much of an intro because I want Erika to speak for herself, like what you do and how you do it and why you do it, because that's the fun of an interview, right? So we're going to go back and forth between general design stuff and then get to some specifics about Shorn. And I suppose the first question is, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Like, how did you start knitting and get into the fiber arts, and how did you get to the point where you're at now?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. I do love watching your podcast, and I think it's a really great way to connect with people internationally, and some people who are very deep into our craft and some people who are newbies trying to discover it. So in terms of my background for fiber arts, I've always been into arts and crafts since I was probably born, since I was a child. And in some ways have the typical story, but in other ways don't. Both of my grandmothers knitted, and one of them very much all the time. I almost can't picture her without knitting needles unless she was cooking. And so when I was young, I would go to her house on days I was homesick from school and watch her knit. But for some reason, I just remember one day when I was old enough, her showing me stockinette, knit and purl. And I remember making this magical little strip and then nothing. And I don't know why. Because I did so many other crafts, but that was almost like the seed. And then fast forward to me having a career, having a child later in life, and suddenly wanting to do for him what she had done for us in terms of Christmas stockings and intarsia sweaters, and being able to have that connection to something that's made by your relative. And I wanted to make those for my son, but I did not know how to knit. And my mother is not a knitter. She does a lot of other crafts, but not a knitter. So I just sort of had that in the back of my head. And I'll put this plug out to anyone who thinks they maybe don't have things to offer other people. There was an ad on Buy Nothing. So Buy Nothing is a Facebook group where most of the time people are cleaning things out and offering them for free. And someone said, I have nothing physical to offer, but I would love to teach someone to knit. And so I went off to my local library in the very beginning of 2018. My son was not quite 2. And I showed up and was handed a ball of Lion Brand yarn, a couple Bernat needles, shown how to do the knit stitch. The 2 women I'll give a little shout out to. It was Anne who actually taught me to knit, but a woman named Heather who was the founder of the group. And it was a great way to connect with community. So that's how I fast forward, got into knitting. But I had made jewelry. I had done, many other things. And I actually studied art history. So it was kind of all woven throughout.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's funny to hear your story is similar to mine. My great grandmother crocheted, and then it kind of skipped a couple generations. Like my mom crafts, but not knitting. And so I hear this a lot, like people have this kind of like, there's a deeper history in the family of it, and then kind of gets picked back up. So it's fun to hear that's how it happened. And can you talk a little bit about how you made I don't know, do you think of it as a transition from being a knitter to being a designer, or, how did that happen for you? And did it change, does designing change your relationship to, knitting in any way? I'm curious.
Yeah, sure. It is a bit of a transition, except I think it's always something where you're in transition. And I know you've talked about it, and other just knitters or podcasters talked about how patterns used to be, a few paragraphs and you had to go do it. So in a way, knitters used to be designers and back and forth, and you would have a basic recipe and maybe you had a certain stitch you liked and you'd put that in, or you'd modify size and shaping. So it's almost this new phenomenon that there are knitters and there are designers, and one can't be the other. Many of us will bake at home or will cook at home. Are we chefs? I mean, I don't know, we're home chefs, right? And so it's sort of these distinctions. And we do, I think in our craft, we have these superstar designers who you'll go to a festival and people will be taking pictures with them and other things. But outside of knitting, nobody knows that these people are knitting superstar designers. And so we've sort of created this mythological creature, the designer. And so what I would say is sort of my journey to it is a few things. One, I would want to knit something and I couldn't find it in Ravelry, even with the bazillions of patterns that are there. And so you'd say, well, maybe there is a space. Maybe there's something unique that I could bring. And this wouldn't only be about trying to build a creative business, but it would actually be filling something that I'm looking for, filling a gap. And then, there's the, can I do it? And that was a little bit of during the pandemic. I thought, well, what the heck? I'm a new designer. I can see some ways I would like to receive a pattern that might be different from what's out there. So can I do it? And then there's no way I could have done it on the same timeline without having befriended a few people at our local yarn shop, one of whom is now working with me to tech edit my patterns. And she was a champion and said, you can do it. And here's how I'm going to help you get started. So, it's sort of all those things coming together, believing in yourself, knowing what's the worst case scenario. I write a pattern, it stinks. I don't have fun doing it, and I don't do anymore. And then in terms of how it changes the relationship with yarn, I think there is a parallel journey just to how it would change if you continued knitting and not designing. But I think the biggest thing about my relationship with yarn and designing is probably related to stashing yarn more so than specifically how I feel about any type of yarn. Because now, I would have the stash of something I knew I would always want to knit, no matter if it was still available or not available, because I liked it and it would fit in with some type of pattern I wanted to do at some point. And now I am just much more thoughtful about screening questions. And again, maybe that would have happened if I didn't start designing, but I was only knitting and accumulating more as I went. But I have to ask myself, is this for design? Is it for my personal knitting? If I'm not sure, how does it fit into that? How am I going to select it and how am I going to use it and those type of things? So I think that's there. And then even something as basic, right, as price point or fiber or ethically responsible wool sourcing or whatever it is. Like I'm thinking all those things through, both as a consumer and as a designer.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the idea of the screening. I feel like a lot of us could use a good screening to like carry it with us to the yarn festivals and be like, do I need this? Like, yes. Like,
yeah.
Does it belong in my stash for like knitting, for design, for what, like what's the purpose? We can always come up with something, I think. But you did mention yarn selection. And one of the things that we've talked about explicitly and how we actually got in touch is you got in touch with me because you were interested in working with farm-to-skein yarns, and Shorn is obviously one of them. Plenty of them are on the market nowadays. And it seems like I'm so glad to see that, because I feel like it's a way, and I don't know, I've been writing this book about wool and mid-century and everything, and I think about a lot about the wool industry in the United States, and it feels to me like the farm-to-skein industry, I don't even know if I want to call it an industry, it's like a cottage industry. But I feel like it's like a little way to kind of recognize shepherds who are out there doing the work. It's a little bit of a way to, appreciate breed specific wool, to, there are a lot of wonderful things about it. And I'm just curious to hear you talk a little bit about how you got interested in farm-to-skein yarns, because that seems to be, I don't know if you're going to be an exclusive farm-to-skein yarn designer in your future, but right now it seems like that's one of the places that you're really gravitating towards. So I'd love to hear more about why and how.
Yeah, I mean, knitting is, I am not the world's fastest knitter, and even the world's fastest knitter, it still takes time to knit, right? And so I feel like we can't be everything to everyone at all times. And so how can you kind of find a niche where you give yourself permission not to be there forever, but when you're spending time there, you explore it in a way that you're thorough and you can help with the education of it and promote it, and also know like it is okay. I mean, when I started designing, I think there's a lot of parallels in my knitting design to what I did in jewelry design. And, I got into jewelry design because everyone was doing it. It was fun, right? You could kind of pick up some materials for relatively inexpensive with a relatively short time commitment and then produce something beautiful that you could sell and profit from. The difference with knitting is that it takes a lot longer, to produce something. You can't sell it for a lot more, because at the time I was doing jewelry, people were willing to pay a lot more because it was jewelry and it was fashionable and art. And knitting has often been quite devalued, right? So the parallels to the materials and going from little seed beads and glass beads to, I really found a niche in jewelry design with like shell beads, but like exclusive, a special kind of shell, or just different natural beads, natural stones, as opposed to like a polished emerald, right? It's all natural, but there's different ways something feels more organic. And it was the same thing for yarn. So when I jumped in, I was used to my grandmother knitting with acrylic, right? And I think as you're probably doing your book, there's so many strands there about how feminism fits in with that. Because we had women, and instead of giving us more options to choose, we gave us more options and expected us to do everything. And so, of course, to women at a certain time, an acrylic yarn that they could throw in the washing machine without thinking 50 years ahead about climate change seemed like an advancement. And now we're in a place where, we're not sitting here judging people who use acrylic for whatever reasons they use it for, but we want to promote wool for all the beneficial aspects of it. And in some cases, just educate people who might not know. I had a woman take one of my knitting classes once. She hadn't knitted in about, I think she said about 30 years. She had her kids when they were little, and then she was starting to have grandkids and in between. And she just very honestly asked, why are you knitting with wool and not acrylic? Isn't acrylic better? And of course, better is subjective, right? Was it better to her when she was trying to hold down a job and have X number of kids? And that probably. And now I could just give her a few suggestions without saying it's better, but just saying, it's different. And here's the reasons it's different. And to me, for our world, it feels better. But, so I think I'm giving you a very long-winded answer, but in terms of how you get to that fiber space and will I keep designing exclusively in it, I kind of pledged to myself that, I was initially drawn, like I was with those beautiful glass beads, to the colors. So after I got past the threshold of spending a certain amount of money on a skein of yarn, I gravitated toward like these gorgeous hand-dyed colors and what was being done and what was different and that whole artistic piece of it. And we'll probably come back when we talk about the designs, like the artistic authenticity is still why I'm designing, but I've shifted from only looking at colors to really looking at fibers and fiber sources and breed specific and how we can, work with individual shepherds, like you're saying. And I've somewhat pledged to myself that yes, if I want to go design something in a beautiful hand-dyed yarn, either because I had it stashed or because I see it and newly catches my eye, sort of pledging to myself. And I'll also tell you what it would be like to knit that in a farm yarn, even if I do a sample or I don't do a sample. And so I did that with a design this year. And that's when I said, this is kind of where I want to go. I'm going to focus now on designing in farm yarn, but I always want to talk about how it could be done in farm yarn, even if it's not.
Yeah, that's an interesting, I mean, I really love that. And I always appreciate designers that are willing to offer up those tips that we're talking about in terms of yarn selection and helping to educate the, other knitters that if you're going to use this particular yarn, whether it's about price point, fiber,
right,
design elements, whatever it is, like if you're willing to, do that little bit of educating, I think you could go such a long way to not only, as you're saying, recognizing that there's alternatives, that there are just differences out there, and that it doesn't have to be about better. Like we don't have to develop this new hierarchy of, oh, farm yarn is better or 100% wool is better. Like there's a use for everything out there. And it, for a lot of people, like you were saying, having a washable wool, right? I did write about this in the book. Having a washable wool is like, or a washable yarn it's like unbelievable, right? I mean, especially if you have little babies and you need to wash the clothes a lot, it's like there's not necessarily a better. And I really appreciated that you were talking through that, like using that kind of like schema to set things up. It makes a lot of sense. One question that I often get, and I think I'm curious to hear your response to this, is like when people do discover, I'll say discover, that there is such a thing as like actual wool yarn still being made, and that right. You can even go beyond that to like a yarn where you could meet the sheep kind of a thing. How do you find them? Because I feel like a lot of people struggle with that. If you're living not in the country, right, where you can go, like I have shepherds, around me everywhere. I could drive down the road to like 2 or 3 right now, but not everybody has that kind of access or even knows, how do you meet people? How do you talk to people about wool? Where do you buy it if not at a farmer's market? Like, what do you do? So I was just curious if you, in your travels of thinking about design and farm, like, how do you think about that kind of scavenger hunt of like finding these kind of gems?
Yeah, I loved that question. When you gave me a few questions in advance to think about, I really loved that one. And I think it is a scavenger hunt and it continues to be. And some of what we're looking for is like, oh, this awesome farm that's off the grid. Well, if it's off the grid, how are you supposed to find it? So I did make a little bit of a list. And I think, it goes without saying that, first of all, there's probably more around you than you know, whether or not it's accessible for you to actually get there and see it. both, physically as well as whether the farm will let you. That's another question. But just starting some of those searches for things like agricultural cooperatives or fiber sheds or different things in your area, that's kind of a good first screening step. And then if you can find a fiber festival where you can go and touch things and talk to people, there's just no comparison to that, right? So, I mean, we are incredibly fortunate where I am in Massachusetts that it's more like, oh gosh, I hope my husband and son aren't going to say to me, not another fiber festival this weekend, as opposed to, oh, there's one a year and I have to go and plan everything around it. So if you can go, I think the other thing to remember is, you don't have to go and buy everything. You can go and have conversations. You can feel things. Most of the time, as long as people know you're doing it for educational reasons, they'll let you take pictures of a yarn, write down a few notes. The thing is, it is true that some of them you may never be able to find if you want that yarn after the fact, but you can start to make yourself a little journal and just treat it like an educational experience instead of feeling like you bought a sweater's quantity of yarn and then you get home and you say, what did I just do? I'm never going to use this. And it kind of sours you on the experience. And I would say the other thing I wrote down to make sure I remembered is that for people who don't have that, there is a virtual option, and I have just one to give you. I'm sure there are many. I know a lot of the fiber festivals will do like an online day, but one that's on Instagram, so you do have to get to it through Instagram and have access to that. But the New England Farm and Fiber Festival is something that's put on by two farm-to-skein yarn producers, Wing and a Prayer Farm, Tammy, and Prana Delana, which is Amanda, and they teamed up. And you could basically attend what usually is an in-person festival. It's just that they had too many things on their plate one year. So this past year, I guess, so they did it virtually. And you can go on and still watch all of those recordings. And a lot of them are mill tours, farm tours, and you can do that from your desk or your couch or wherever you want to do it from. So, anything like that you can do to just kind of gain that experience, then you can start your online hunt or your in-person hunt, right? And sometimes there are in-person local yarn shops, but finding ones that are really focused on farm-to-skein yarn is not easy. And if they have it, chances are it's not online. So it's kind of you could make some phone calls though. You could ask around. And then online shops. I mean, when I don't even know how I first found your podcast, but then found out you had this online yarn shop, I was like, this is amazing. This is what we all need. And it's just there's not a lot of places that are like marketplaces for farm yarn. And part of that is because so much that we do, right, is dictated by an ability to make a profit. You have to cover your costs. And so if the farmers have to cover their costs, the shepherds, and then, all of the pieces along the way, and you're doing it, it's sort of like, are you doing it just for the love of promotion for it? And you can only do that to a certain extent, right? So I think just the more we can have it normalized, there's a few others I've found in my scavenger hunt. So I'll name them. This isn't an endorsement. It's not a promotion. It's not anything. It's just, how have I found things? And I've maybe found a specific breed that I want to work with. So then you have more that you can sort with, right? So I did a design and I wanted to do it in Targhee, and I just had to start looking for it. And I came across Lana's Mountain Meadow wool. And those are both producers that are, again, you're going to have like different price points because they're doing it at a different scale. And there's a different scale for different breeds in the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States. And it's just sorting through all of that. And then you'll have cooperatives, which I do know locally, like Green Mountain Spinnery. And there are many like that, right? So you'll have the Woolery. And then I wrote down a couple others that I discovered probably, I think I discovered them through their podcast, but like the Woolly Thistle and Fleece and Harmony. And so you kind of, the more you listen, the more you look and just have your eyes open. I think that's how you do it. And then the other quick thing I wanted to mention is the baby steps you can take. So maybe you're on this hunt for farm yarn, but you said, but I haven't touched it. And I'm so worried it's going to be crunchy or scratchy or all these things. Like, what is a step you can take in that direction that maybe you can either feel it in advance or it's at a price point that's more accessible? And there are companies like Barocco and Cascade and Knit Picks, and they have eco wools. And maybe you're more comfortable trying something like that on your way to the farm yarns. And I just, I think that those are all possibilities out there sort of on that continuum and that hunt, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was thinking, as you were talking, I was thinking about all the networking that has to happen, or that you can do. Like if you can get in touch with one producer or one person at a fiber festival, they will
Yeah.
often know at least, it's like what is that, 6 degrees of separation,
Yeah.
right? They'll often know at least six other producers. And from them, you can kind of like then, it's like old fashioned networking, or like presenting
Yeah.
yourself in Victorian England, like with like, here's my calling card. Like, can you connect me to the next person? Um,
Exactly.
and it's like when I went over to the bed and breakfast just last week, I got to talking with Nancy, and we both had in common so many other, the Finger Lakes Fiber Mill and Susan and Jay, and it was like, oh, you know them, oh, and then she didn't know a few people knew, and I didn't know a few people she knew, and it was great to kind of, you start to kind of see the nodes in the network, and wool
Right.
people know wool people, like they need to connect with each other because they need
Yes.
that support, and then they want to because they can share vets, they can share shearers, they can, there are all these different things that are so cooperatively and communally necessary if you're working in wool, that they want
Right.
to connect with each other, right? So then they want to connect you with everyone else. So it can be,
Especially now. I mean,
yeah,
there's one place you can send your wool to be scoured in the United States, really, right? I mean, so everybody has to, and then the parts of the mills, when you find the small mills, they all have to rely on each other, because it's not like you call up, it's like the Maytag repairman, right? Like you have to find a part that might be in somebody else's mill in a barn that hasn't been touched for 50 years.
exactly. And that was exactly one of the stories that Nancy told me about. She's like, oh, Jay, like the finger lakes or Woolen Mill, he showed up at somebody's shop and they were like, oh, well, the spinner's not been working, and he just went over there and tinkered with it.
Right.
It's like you need those people who have that engineering brain to figure out
Yes.
what's going to happen. So if you could, I don't know if you're interested in getting into yarn design at all, like doing your own farm to skein yarn, but one question I always like to ask designers when I'm talking to them is like, what would be not necessarily your like ideal yarn, your forever yarn, like I always want to knit with this yarn, but like if you could design a farm to skein yarn that you wanted to work with next, do you have like a designs percolating? Like, do you start with the yarn? Do you start with the design? Like, how does this work? What would that yarn look like?
So I'm going to use the example of what I am designing in right now, because it's real. It's an authentic story. And it's not always that I start with the yarn and then come up with the design or the concept and the yarn. It's always like this matching game where in my head I'll have some ideas, and that's what happened with one of the Shorn designs. And then, you kind of wait for the yarn to come along. And in other cases, you pick up the yarn because you see it, it's beautiful. You met the shepherds and they, you had a good connection with them, or there was the color, or whatever it was. And so I did have a farm to skein yarn, which is now my souvenir yarn when I go locally. And it was from Norwich Knits in Vermont. And it was from Hands and Heart Farm. Catherine Knox is the shepherd there. And so I had this, well, I can hold it up if that's okay. I had this yarn that I picked for the colors. And
Oh, wow.
it was these beautiful colors. And it is, I can tell you, this is where I might need my glasses. We'll see if I can pull it off. It's Border Leicester Romney. And I've since learned from her that the merino in it is just a 20% merino that's added by the mill to her flock when she adds it. But one of the things that I find you don't find a ton in farm yarn is also the beautiful hand dyed, unless it's also superwash, right? And then it's gone through a different. So this to me was really unique to find and this is what I would probably say if I could, pick something, because there's so many beautiful natural colors. And I have seen some that are on my list of want to work with for sure. And then I really love to design. I love to design in the natural colors, as you saw with Shorn, but I am still sometimes drawn to the way that hand-dyed yarn on a natural base can look and really reflect that piece of nature also. So I would say that's probably, it is what I'm designing with next. And I've paired it with a farm yarn from Meadow Fed Lamb, which is in Hadley, Massachusetts. And this is a little snippet of a swatch I have going on. So and nice. This year, I've designed the whole yoke of the sweater already. I'm really jazzed about it. It's the hydrangea here this year are just off the charts gorgeous. So I've designed a yoke sweater with these two farm yarns and just some different texture and some different designs. Because again, that's something that isn't necessarily as out there. I think it's a unique, not to say product, right? But it's just something unique where I feel like I'm putting myself as an artist into the design, and then, doing some different things with shaping, but nothing crazy fancy. Just it's letting the yarns speak and letting them reflect something that's inspired me.
Yeah, it's so nice.
And then I think too, the other piece, like you talked about designing the yarn. So in terms of actual yarn structure, those are 2-ply and they're beautiful and they're working great for what they are. I think if you wanted to make the most versatile yarn, I do the 3-ply, right? You can use it for cables and you can use it for color work. The only thing maybe you'd prefer a 2-ply for would be lace. But I haven't designed a ton in that. I'll use little bits of cable and little bits of lace. So a middle ground one is fine. 2 or 3-ply is fine for me, but there is something unique about having also a farm yarn that's hand dyed, that's 3 or more plies. I've been talking to Catherine about that this week because she really has a niche there, I think. And I have another design that's in testing now for a vest. So I shared that with her, that for people who want to use a farm yarn, she has a really unique opportunity there to have that combination of characteristics in the yarn.
Yeah, that's great. It's the plies are interesting. Like as someone who's done on the production end of things, like you only have so many fleece, and the more plies you do, like if you have 50 pounds and you go into 3-ply as opposed to 2-ply, it's like you end up with less yarn in the end.
Right.
So for a lot of people, it depends on how big their flock is and what kind of mill they're working with and whether the mill can process smaller batches, and
so
many different questions into this.
Yes. That you never thought or at least I never thought when I first picked up 2 sticks and a ball of yarn, I was going to be thinking about later. I think, probably some of my friends and family think I'm a little crazy at how deeply I've gone down the hole, but
we all have, though. You're not alone. That's the thing, right? It's like you go down.
I always joke. It's like wool sniffers unite, right?
It's true. It's true. It's something that Spencer has come to appreciate over time, but he's like, the smell, you like the smell of the fruit. I'm like, oh yeah. It's like, there's something about it that's gorgeous. Right. But speaking of overdying, I feel like it's one of the things that is also, we don't often talk about it with farm yarn. I know a few of my producers that in the shop that do overdye their yarns, and I absolutely love them. I'm with you. Like it's one of those things where you get the awesome properties of the wool farm-to-skein yarn, but then you also get the kind of versatility of multiple colors and the possibilities for that. And I'm all for like the whatever, how many colors of Shetland wool there are out in the world, but natural colors, sometimes you want a different palette to design to wear. And even something I feel like people don't know often, that even something that's like this dark, like the darkest of the Shorns, you can still overdye this. You just have to choose your dyes carefully. I've overdyed the brown plain yarn like this into like eggplant and like rich reds and greens and blues. Like you just have to choose the right kind of shades for the dyes. I'm not a dye, I'm not a color person, but there are correct terms here, I'm sure.
Well, I think Harrisville, is it they do like the daylight, and then I just had it and I've lost the word, like night shades and daylight or something. So overdying on the different colors. Yeah.
And it's totally possible. It's just, you have to think about what you're, going to end up with in the end.
Right.
You can't go from this to like yellow. It's not going to work. But if you go in the other direction, you're all right. So you'd mentioned meeting some shepherds. Do you have any particular sheep or shepherds that have influenced you in this farm yarn?
Yes, definitely. And I think also it's important to recognize that I'm relatively new to this, and some of these people I'm going to mention are too, and to be very respectful and sort of pay tribute to the people who have been doing this forever, who are like, how about me out there? The 2 people I want to mention right off the bat are Peg and Amanda from Junction Fiber Mill. And part of the reason is, well, there's a few reasons. One is because they got into this mill work not to produce a commercial yarn of like they're making tracks, which is successful and really helping them financially keep going. But they got into it to do small batch mill work for people with these, small flocks. And so part of what they've done, it's like this whole idea. I used to work in advancement for nonprofits. So this whole idea of like doing well by doing good. But they really personify it because they have a mill cast, and on their mill cast, they're also telling the stories of all of these other shepherds who are willing to share them. So they're not only there doing the work, they're not only there making their own yarn, but they're also telling you sort of why they did it and those stories, and they're bringing those to a much broader audience. And they also have sheep and flock themselves. And that's how Peg, for example, got into it. She had her Savage Heart Farm flock. And I actually got to visit the farm, and it's like children, right? Like the way that she looks at her flock, it's just so heartwarming. And it's something that I can appreciate unbelievably. And yet, I'm not a shepherd. So it's an interesting relationship, seeing how they're part of the family, really, right? And so another person to mention, who's not necessarily a shepherd, but Clara Parks. She has told, Knitlandia and Vanishing Wool are two, if you're an audiobook person, you don't have to even find time to read the physical book, put the audiobook in while you're knitting. These are stories that, talk, and people who talk about the whole industry and about many different individuals, because individual shepherds do not always have time to tell their stories. So those are some people I wanted to mention in terms of a broader, bringing you like a broader story. But then on a more individual basis, I've already mentioned that I've just recently connected with Catherine Knox of Hands and Heart Farm, and we've had some interesting conversations. She wrote, I think she said it was like the foreword to Vermont Wool Source Book. And it's been really interesting seeing different people's expertise and how, you as a newbie can also offer expertise to someone who's trying to produce farm yarn for knitters. Yeah. And then Rachel Haas and Matt Kaminsky of Meadowfed Lamb. Again, I mentioned their work, but I met them at the Winter Farmers Market in Wayland, Massachusetts, and they had a little tiny table with a few skeins of yarn and their meat, because they do both meat and yarn production. And just there's some kind of vibe with shepherds, people in general, right? But shepherds, where there's just like this extra layer of, they are giving you the gift of their yarn that came from their flock. And it's not just transactional. It's so much more than that. And when they see someone buying farm yarn who is going to do something with it, it's going to have as much care and meaning to them as it takes them to get to the skein point, there's just a different connection with them. And I know we're going to talk separately about the cowl design, but obviously Paula Ahrens from Dancing Pony Sheep Farm, hearing her story. And now I have met her. I had met her in person a number of times before I heard the story she told that inspired the cowl design. But then meeting her and connecting with her after that, it was, again, just a different level of knowing how people in their flocks and shepherds in their flocks. It's just a very, very special relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe this is the perfect moment to kind of switch over a little bit to talking about the actual designs. I know I wanted to ask you about the stories that you want to tell with your designs, but that's kind of part of, what you're doing. Yes. Maybe we could talk a little bit about this Mobius cowl.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. I know. I love that we now both have them that we can hold up, right?
I know.
So fun. So I think there's nothing like hearing someone's story firsthand from them. And I want to direct people to the Millcast where Paula tells the story that inspired this. So it's the Junction Fiber Mill Millcast, episode 71. Go hear it directly from Paula, but I want to tell you how that inspired this design. I listen to the Millcast nearly weekly. I won't say I'm a groupie by any means, but I just appreciate the stories, right? Something to look forward to with my coffee on Tuesday morning. And when Paula's came on, it's a little phase of life here, but like I was waterworks in tears listening to this story. It was unbelievable. So the little teaser that I'll give anybody who's not going to go over and watch it themselves is that Paula was trained as a dancer, and she worked in, I think, physical therapy, I want to say, and became a shepherd. She wasn't born a shepherd. She became a shepherd and had to learn about taking care of sheep. And in her first year of having these sheep, there was a real struggle with her favorite ewe during lambing. And it was a very sad, but very, nature is nature story, where she formed this bond. And the ewe is still with us. It's Ellie Mae. And but she and Ellie Mae ended up with a bond that would rival anyone in their favorite pets bond. And when there was this tragedy for the sheep flock, they took care of each other in a way that Paula couldn't believe she was witnessing. It was as extraordinary as any human group would ever take care of each other, and probably even more so. And part of what they did was to form what I'm calling sheep circles. And they protect each other. So they will form a circle around whomever or whatever is in distress. Fast forward, and Paula had her own distress a few years later, and the sheep did this same phenomenon to her. And if if it's possible to watch this without a dry eye, it's not.
I'm already like, edit out the tears.
And here she is telling this story on the Millcast, and everybody's getting teared up, and it's just this whole like unbelievable connection between sheep and human beings, and it was extraordinary. And I said in my head, people need to hear this story even more, and I want to design something like that. So I kind of filed it away. And then when you asked for designs in your farm yarn, I was like, oh my gosh, if this ever worked out, it would be amazing. Because what you can see is that a few things. This is a Mobius cowl. And of course, the idea of a Mobius cowl is that there's really no inside or outside. And to me, there was something about that was like, there was this circle, and it's called Unbroken Circle, because what happens in these stories is that the sheep don't break the circle. The person or animal in distress will say when they're ready to kind of move on. And so there's this idea that you can't break this circle. And it also ties back a little bit. There's a song, Will the Circle Be Unbroken? Mm-hmm. And when I was doing other work for a different pattern, that song was actually part of kind of the playlist in my head, because it's this, whether you're religious or not, or faithful or into folk music, there is this whole concept of the unbroken circle. Mm-hmm. And that sort of played in. And then as I worked on it and worked on what the design concept would be, it had this duality to it. And so there's a duality here where, of course, it switches halfway through from dark and light being the more dominant color. And so there's that idea that we take care of the flock and the flock takes care of us. And then as I continued to go, and I'm going to show you a little bit about the story of designing it. So before I got the shorn yarn, I said, I've got to start working this design out, because when it comes, I need to be really ready for it. So I actually went and got some Brooklyn tweed yarn, and I had started just trying to work out the circles with a dark and a light. Yeah. And I did this one first, because I did it on paper, and then I put it here, and I thought, well, that looks more like Space Invaders than some kind of sheep circle. And then I got here, which was more of a circle, but it was more like a chocolate chip cookie. And so I just kind of kept going. And then the shorn yarn came. And so then I said, okay, well, now I can figure it out in the actual yarn I'm working in. And I started swatching here. And when I started swatching here, a couple of things happened. One, all of a sudden I saw an actual sheep staring back at me. Yeah. And that wasn't happening with my chocolate chip cookie or my Space Invaders. And then I started figuring out, how could I make them? I wanted some geometric shape to just break up all the circle, because all the circles started to feel too much like bubbles or too many circles to me. And so I kind of came up with this idea that this would be the sheep moving in on you when you're in distress and they're coming toward you, but also have this geometric shape that somewhat broke it up. Mm. And, I was experimenting with I could have gone in so many directions. I was experimenting with different things that I won't bore you with, but I found the shapes I wanted. I found this, I started knitting it up. I saw these little sheep staring back at me, the dark sheep with the light face, the light sheep with the dark face. You were knitting it in the round, of course, because the construction is a Mobius cowl. So the whole time you're doing it, you're knitting it around. And then if you think about this is like the sheep going, all the way around again here. So it just came together in a way that sometimes special designs come together. And it's Paula's story, but it's also probably the story of so many shepherds who don't get to tell their story. And you wanted to highlight farm yarn, and it just came together like that, because that's what those types of designs do for me once they get in my head. Yeah, I had the concept, I had, the yarn, and then it was like making the match. So, yeah.
And it's perfect. It's a nice weight. It feels really good. It's not a tight around your neck kind of color. It really, when you put it on, it has like a little bit of a vibe. Like you put it under a jacket. It just feels really good. And the symmetry is so pretty, because you can decide if you want one side or the other. If you want to kind of like,
right. You can even have it kind of all one color, if you want.
It's big enough. Yeah, it's big enough to be able to do that, which is really cool. I love the like circles within circles within circles. It's really, take an idea and really run with it in a way that's it's not overdone at all. It's just really special. And I absolutely love this. So it makes me very thank you for doing it. It makes me very happy.
Yes. Oh, thank you.
And this is just two skeins of yarn. This was just one of the light and one of the dark.
Right.
For the whole
Right.
thing.
And, yeah. Great. Yeah.
I love that. I love it when you can and it uses up most of the yarn, almost all.
Yes.
So it's
I try to do that in my designs too. And I also try to have like a bailout point. So if it's not working, you can, obviously this design, there is a place where it's a little bit different where it comes together when you graft it at the end. Yeah. But, so that's sort of right here. And this is where your two circles converge. Yeah. But, it's flexible. If you are running out of yarn, you can end it sooner. You can make it, some people have made it narrower, so we'll just do like one fewer repeat here or whatever it is. So yeah, but we want to use this cherished yarn that we have and not have waste as much as possible. So I try to design it so that you can use up as much as you have.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, I love this. I want to say it's like I feel like it's a very beginner friendly pattern. It's color work, but it's very like the color work repeats itself. There aren't a lot of long floats that you're dealing with. You're working in the round. Like there are all these things that make it really beginner friendly. So I feel like it's a great option if somebody wanted to try, whether you were trying it in Shorn V or some other farm yarn. It's like you just need two colors and ability to knit in the round with a little bit of color, a little bit of color float management, and you can this, which is really cool.
And I know that you did, I kind of forgot to mention, but these are pearls. So it gives texture to the sheep, but there's no reason that if you are just saying I'm not up for pearls and color work, just change them to knit stitches. It's fine. It's not gonna change anything here. So
I thought the same thing when I was knitting. I was like, the pearls are cool because it adds the texture, like a bohos kind of design. Exactly. But it would be just as fine from a distance. You couldn't necessarily tell that it's pearl or knit stitches. So if you wanted to just try this as your first color work without the pearls, it would be perfect.
Yes. This can be your sheep with a lot of crimp, and the other ones can be like your fin sheep with less crimp or something. I don't know.
Exactly, it's perfect in that way. Should we move over and talk about this beautiful shawl you designed? This is the Shearing Day Shawl. Which I love the names of these. Like they just talk about narrative, right? Like talk about storytelling. It's really
exactly.
Exactly.
So the Shearing Day Shawl, we wanted to highlight all three colors that you have in the collection this year. And similarly, this one came together for me because I already had part of this floating in my brain. So I'm going to hold up when I designed something called the 700 fence post cowl, which is a mouthful, I know, but I wasn't on my not my marketing game that day, but I decided I was going with it for the reasons I was going with it, and it didn't matter. So I designed a cowl in a hand-dyed organic merino yarn with a different story behind it. And then when I was doing test knits of it, I decided to do it in farm yarn one day. So this is yarn from Junction Fiber Mill. And what happens with the construction of this is that you actually knit it like a shawl, and then you join it and you knit the other side. So it becomes a seamless cowl on the bias. And I made it through a certain section of this. And I said, I really wish I wasn't doing a sample right now, because this would make the most beautiful farm yarn shawl. And so I just kind of cataloged it in my head for something I wanted to revisit. But then, again, I don't want to just, number one, I don't want to just repeat something I've already done. And number two, I'm making design decisions for a reason that are either based with the yarn or the story or whatever it is I want to do. So the only thing I really took from this was the way that I liked how this pattern worked out, and everything else I've changed. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know where I was going to start in terms of stitches, but I said the whole point is shearing day. Like, this is about natural farm yarns and how we want to highlight them. And so what I did is I started with the darkest color and I worked through one section of this. And then I found this stitch pattern. And the funny thing here is I chose it because it was a beautiful way to highlight three natural colors. And then as I was knitting it unintentionally, my little lambs lined up and all started staring at me again.
Yeah.
And so I think there's something subconscious or just intuitive where you're looking at something, you're choosing it, not necessarily for that reason. Or like when I was designing the circles, And then all of a sudden, you realize that there's a deeper layer to it. And that's kind of like an artistic thing that you can't necessarily articulate or replicate. It just sometimes happens. So when I did that, I said, well, now we're at a point where I really wanted to get some cables in because it is a beautiful 3-ply. And I know that you enjoy doing cables. And I also thought it was nice to kind of have a little bit of variety. So you've got this mosaic, unlike the cowl, which is stranded. This is mosaic. You're only holding one at a time, or slip stitch, however you'd like to refer to it. And I wanted to get in cables, but like you're saying, how do you pick those? And are you willing to rip it out if you've picked something that just doesn't go well? And yes, absolutely. As well as figuring out what colors to put it in. Mm-hmm. So I had all of my little swatches here. This is the one in the light color that I ultimately did go with, but I wanted to try it also in the gray. And the reason I've got stitch markers here is I was figuring out from the different ways these patterns are written, which technique I wanted to use. And I needed to remind myself which one I was doing which technique on. And then I would hold it up and take pictures of it, at this point. And I take pictures with the white, and I take pictures with the medium beigeish color, and try to figure it out. And then I would actually swatch it on the needle. So that's sort of a little designer tip I would give people is swatching it on the needles means you just take this little section and knit it down, and then you see if you like that. And that's what I did as well with proportions. So I mentioned that I had studied art history. A lot of my design is intuitive, and it's not based on a particular formula, but there was this idea that I kept the woven slip stitch sections equal. And then I sort of went from a small, and then, here's kind of one proportion, like 2 repeats. It's not exactly, 1, 2, and then 3, but there is intentionality there in terms of, you can probably see it better behind you, but in terms of that idea that you're sort of going narrower, medium, larger. Yep. And anybody who wants to knit it differently certainly can, but there is thought behind that and why it happens.
Yeah. It's one of the cool things about this shawl. And when we were talking about the design process, in the end, you ended up making this last section optional depending on your yardage, which I think is perfect, because even if without that final section, you still have, it preserves, the proportionality that you've built into this design, and it preserves, the knitter's ability to work through the different stitch patterns, and like you get the full experience of the shawl. It's just in a slightly different yardage or slightly different size if you need. And I thought that solution was brilliant when we were going back and forth, like, what do we do? There's so much of this, in each skein, like how do we deal with this? I thought your design resolution was brilliant. So that was great.
Yeah. And it's nice to be able to do that and do it in partnership. Right. And so that's where a designer, a tech editor, test knitters, and if you have a yarn partner, nobody should be the one person making all the decisions, and it is just kind of working through what do you think is best. So we came up with a solution that both worked for the pattern and the usability of the pattern, and not having to have different versions. And also sometimes people just want something smaller. Sometimes people might run out of one yarn but have something else in their stash they could use to finish it, and I've done that many times with yarns that are comparable. So having those options, and then also maximizing what you have so you don't have tons of leftovers.
Yeah, it's a brilliant design that way, because it really does, it highlights the yarns, I think, each individual color, how they work with each other. It's, again, I think, beginner friendly, because you don't have the color work. Right here, you have the slip stitches like you were talking about, and you have a little bit of cabling.
Yeah.
But it's simple cabling, and the rest of the pattern is very accessible. So it's like you made both of these patterns accessible to the level of knitter that, I enjoy it as someone who's been knitting for the last 12 or 13 years. I enjoyed both of them because there's so much going on at any one time, and it's just fun, and it's like it switches. So you're always kind of like excited for the next section. And there's interesting things going on with construction, over here, and the stitch patterns over here. So it's like, I feel like they're patterns that can be enjoyed by knitters of all different skill levels and interests, and in different yarns even. Which I think is great. That's a sign. To me, that's a mark of a good design. It's like versatility and interest level, and all those things. So
thank you. Yeah, well, I know one of our test knitters did do the shorter version. So if people want to see what that looks like, that's there. And then one of the test knitters for the cowl, her partner scooped it up, and so he's been wearing it. And I said, "Oh, this is so exciting because so often people will think, oh, I can't knit that for a man, right? And you absolutely can. I mean, you want to knit it for a man who's going to wear it, just like you want to knit it for a woman who's going to wear it. But I love seeing that gender neutrality with designs too. And I thought that was really nice. So
yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good, and this, I do especially think this is like a very, yeah, gender neutral. You could, anybody could wear this. Spencer is often stealing my knitting. So he'll probably steal this one too. I put it away so that I could do the yarn launch and everything with it. But once it's out in circulation, I mean, there's no telling what's going to happen. So, I want to ask you one final question, which is about you and Grapefruit and Gardenia, which is your, would you consider it to be, it's kind of like your design name, your brand name.
Yeah.
What are you doing with it? What's the plan for you for the future?
Yeah.
Designing.
Well, I kept it broad beyond knitting, right? When I was choosing a name. And when I chose the name, I thought, I want this to be not about me in an egotistical way, about me in a unique design, never tied to one specific craft, just sort of this umbrella of like, what am I bringing to things? And I ended up coming up with that name because when I was a teenager, I went to one of those shops that made you a custom scent, right? So it was like, this is you. This is truly who you are. But I loved that scent and I've never been able to quite replicate it. This shop is long gone. It was called Essence, so it's sort of like the essence of who you are. And they blended oils for you and they blended this Gardenia Soft, it was called, with grapefruit. And not only did I love the smell and wear it forever, but, it was this idea that reminds me of who I am, which is like this duality. Like grapefruit is sort of kind of sassy, right? And it's like citrus, but it's got a zing. And Gardenia is like this soft, romantic in the garden. And that's kind of what my personality is like. I've got the zing and I've got the relaxed, just, well, whatever. it's like the fire and the ice or whatever, I guess. But it's this two sides, right? But also kind of nicely blended together. And so that's where I came up with the name and what I did. And I like to do ice dyeing. I do some knitted finished products, but now it's really more about designing and trying to think of other things I've done. I mean, I've done this craft fair that I run as a volunteer over here for 41 years. It's the 41st year of this craft show. I've done it since I was years old, right? I am 47, so you can do the math on that one. My son does it now. And throughout the years, sometimes it's been jewelry. It's been all these different crafts, and it's not in a way that's like running toward what's popular. It's just that we all have these maker journeys. And so now mine is focused on design. And so that's the umbrella for it. And where I'm going, we'll see. I am hoping to do more workshops. I think, you had mentioned in one thing that I am a certified coach as well, right? And I focused on life coaching and I focused on women in transition. And I don't know exactly where it's going, but I know that it has to be authentic to me and my story and being curious and being kind. And so I might not be the person who is going to give you the most expertise on sweater design and construction and exactly the way to do certain techniques. But I am going to bring stories to light and I am going to make connections to, things that I think are important and honor my values and design things in a way that somebody, I hope someday, will look at my portfolio and go, oh, I can tell that's your design, like I can do with other designers. And that, that could include anything as we go forward. But definitely for now, I do like that focus on farm yarn and, tying it together and really how that aligns with my values and the type of knitter that I want to connect with because we share certain commonalities, but not at the expense of not connecting with others.
Yeah. It's a nice encapsulation of what you do, what you've done, and where you want to go. And you seem open to a lot of possibilities. And I feel like a lot of us crafters, I think it's easy to get kind of stuck in, oh, I am a knitter, or I am a spinner, or I am whatever I am. I'm a jewelry maker. Whereas it's, a lot of us have these journeys that are just, we move, right? We get interested in things. We find other ways to express ourselves creatively. And those are all beautiful transitions, as you were talking about. So it's good to embrace them and allow yourself the freedom to move into something new when it interests you. And it doesn't mean giving up the old, but it means, there's a different kind of path that you can follow, which is kind of fun to think about. So, yeah. Well, I just want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. And just doing these beautiful designs. I really feel like you honored the yarn and the sheep. I know Kathy was like so excited to know that you were working with the yarn. Um, so thank you. Thank you for taking the time to do all of it. And I'm just excited for the yarn launch to come and to get everybody out here to, play with this yarn and see your patterns and see this video with you talking about all your design inspiration and everything. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And thanks to Kathy for the sheep, and thanks to Paulo for the story, and everyone who really brought us all together and connected us.
Yeah, exactly.